Do you want to do an impersonation of Mark?
No. I don't. That's racist.
Hi folks, welcome to the Unsung Podcast. I'm your host, Mark Fraser.
I feel like you need to talk a lot faster than that.
Does Mark talk fast?
Yes, have you not noticed?
I'm so used to it. No, I don't think I do notice that, no. So, you join us this week. It's myself and Vicky.
Hello.
Mark is up to no good. What is Mark doing? He used to make up stuff about where David was. Fighting polar bears.
He's not hiding under a desk.
Right.
That's topical. It's to do with the Prime Minister, because she never turned up to Parliament yesterday and got somebody else to answer all the questions after they did a kind of U-turn on that thing, that disastrous budget. And then nope, she wasn't there, and everybody was like, where is she, and the Penny Mordaunt they got to answer the question said, she's not under a desk, she's taking that's how they speak in Parliament, she's taking care of some very urgent business. And that's what Mark's doing, he's taking care of some very urgent business, not under a desk.
Mark's the Liz Truss of this podcast. What does that make us?
Oh Christ, you're, I don't know, Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Oh, for fuck's sake.
What am I?
Theresa May.
Oh shit,
No
that's
offense.
fine, I can deal with that. Come on with
You
that.
got that weird reptile walk.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas I'm just a reptile. Alright, well, as you probably gathered, Mark's not with us this week, so Vicky and I are going to present what is now part one of a two-part show. As mentioned previously, we are going to cover the album Harmacy by the band Sebadoh. And this had initially been mooted to be a healthy one episode show, but genuinely by pure coincidence, as we were preparing to do it, I remembered that the band Dinosaur Jr had rescheduled their shows that were cancelled last year, and it just so happened that those were falling the exact same week. And it also just so happened that the place they were playing was just up the road from my house, so I literally via a helpful friend called Charlie, managed to get in touch with Lou Barlow, who's a founding member of Dinosaur Jr, but also a founding member of Sebadoh. And Lou very kindly agreed to sit down for a quick interview with me. And that was great, because there was a lot of things we were going to be speculating on, and he shed a bit of light on those, and he also threw up probably just as many new questions. So what we're going to do is, this week, we will give you a little bit of background, because we're mindful of the fact that a lot of the audience might not be familiar with Sebadoh, or at least as familiar with Sebadoh. So we'll try and bring a bit of context into it that way. Then we'll hand it over to Lou for the interview that we did, and then we'll come back, and then you can join us next week for part two, when we'll do what's a more typical episode, where we look at the back catalogue, we'll discuss some of the points that come up in the interview, and then we'll look at Harmacy in a bit more detail. Before we get to that, governmental admin, we are a podcast that is funded by your money. The exchequer of Unsung needs more of your money
to help the most vulnerable bands in society. Yeah,
it's a trickle down economy, so if you give us all your cash, knowledge will trickle down from us into your lives.
Doesn't sound nice, does it?
I've been to worse parties. So yes, we have subs, we have a record club. The record club's great. Vicky can vouch for that as the owner of a new record player. She's benefiting from a couple of kickbacks. We have some awesome albums that are available for people that want to subscribe to the record club. But you know what, this week we're not going to try and get you involved in the record club, because if you don't know what's good for you, too bad. Natural selection will weed you out. The fact is, we would like people who listen to the show to simply subscribe at the lowest level. That's going to be £4 a month. You're going to get more than a show per pound when you consider that by subscribing you also get all the bonus features, and we have got loads of very entertaining bonus episodes, and you also get a couple of other additional benefits, like you can get involved with the AAA Unsung group on Facebook, you know, where people basically suggest ideas for episodes. We get a lot of direct feedback, we have discussions with regular listeners and commentators, and we can fold their thoughts into a lot of the episodes. So if you've got an album you'd really love to pitch to us and you really want to get hold of us directly, subscribe. We'll check you out, we'll chat to you on that group, and we'll see if it makes a grade. So Patreon.com/unsung pod, is that right?
I believe so.
Without Mark's professionalism, we're all over the shop. Yeah, and just come in at the lowest level. If you're somebody that's enjoyed the show, you know, if you've enjoyed 4 episodes of the show, £4 would be lovely. It all contributes to
you also get the podcast on a Friday as opposed to a Monday.
That's right, you get it early.
And then when the podcast comes out on a Monday, I'm like, all those basic bitches listening to it on a Monday. I listened to it 3 days ago.
Look at them reacting. Yeah, so that would be really good. We'd really appreciate that. It is sometimes a struggle to keep things motoring because we're all balancing lives as well, and having that little bit of fallback cash to enable us to devote a bit of extra time to the show is very, very helpful. We don't want to get adverts involved if we can help it, but we do need to do something to justify the crazy amount of research time, especially. Yeah. So with that out of the way, we're going to talk a little bit about Sebadoh. Now, I have chosen the album Harmacy from 1996.
Now it feels like I'm on fire. It's burning the world through. But don't hold it against me, 'cause I know you're lying too.
This is, off the top of my head, I think their 6th album.
Yeah.
It came out in Sub Pop in the States, it came out in Domino over and here in the UK, it came out in another label in Germany, I think. And was it my first introduction to the band? Possibly. They're a band that, and I'm sure a lot of people can sympathise here, you see their name and variations of their name, because there's also a project called Sebadoh, and there are also a bunch of affiliated acts. There's the Folk Implosion, and then, as we mentioned, Lou Barlow's involved in Dinosaur Jr. They have a big extended universe around them, and they were also part of a really fecund indie scene in the States in the early 90s. I mean, even in fact in the late 80s, Sebadoh formed in 86, and you know, so I think they were a band before Pixies. Certainly they didn't arrive long after Sonic Youth, and they kind of went right through that era and beyond. So they've got a lot of history.
Were you aware of Sebadoh before you were aware of Dinosaur Jr?
I think I was aware of Dinosaur Jr. first, but I think I could have told you a Sebadoh tune first. Dinosaur Jr., Sebadoh, when I was first getting into Nirvana, you saw these names mentioned. One of the first times I recall seeing the name Sebadoh is because Nirvana's aborted final tour, the tour that was meant to start just shortly after Kurt Cobain committed suicide, would have featured Sebadoh, and I think it was the Raincoats. And a friend of mine had a ticket for a show in Edinburgh at Studio 24, which would have had all 3 bands. So it was a name around about that time. You just started seeing it around, a bit like Pavement and all that. And it took me a while as a young'un to sort of familiarise myself with all these different bands. I also happen to have a friend who looks exactly like Lou Barlow, so that...
Who?
Matt.
Oh yeah, I see that. Totally.
Running gag. So Sebadoh were one of the first few bands I got into at that time. I'd heard bits and bobs. Nothing had completely convinced me, but I believe it was Europa Music in Stirling put the album Harmacy on in the store for me, and this was the album that I was like, I'm pretty sure I like the stuff on this more than anything else by them. And yeah, in the long term, that's proven to be the case as well. However, that is, it seems, quite an unfashionable position, including with the band themselves.
Yeah.
Many of the people I've met in the years since who like Sebadoh seem to have a real affinity with albums like Bubble and Scrape.
As you walk away, think of all the joy we share.
which is when they were still in their sort of 4-track home recording phase big time. Bakesale, the album that came directly before this, which is still a little bit rawer.
Not an Adam or Eve, I'm just a nervous young thing. Hear my voice strange as I sing. My will will bend and then break. The cradle break and I fall. I couldn't help it at all. I've got a license to confuse. What have you got to lose? And a license to...
And then all the way back, I mean, you'll hear what Lou has to say about it, but he's a fan of Sebadoh 3.
I was battling you, trying to prove myself. I tried to bury you with guilt. I wanted to prove you wrong. I've got nothing better.
So yeah, I think this is a good example of Unsung in the sense that this is an album that seems to have elicited a lot of mixed feelings in people that were into the band. And I just don't understand that. I think it's so consistent. It's really, really strong with great tunes, scattered with fun tunes as well. It's got some silly bits in it. It covers a lot of the bases that the band cover. And that event, if you can level a consistent criticism at them, it's probably that they're quite erratic.
Inconsistent,
yeah. That they throw a lot of different things at the wall on their albums, punk and noise and silly kind of fun songs, and then really romantic, yearning, melancholy songs.
Does that come from having two main songwriters, do you think?
Well, actually, at this point it was two main songwriters, but prior to that it was three. So that's another interesting thing about Sebadoh, is that they were a democracy when it came to songwriting. Eric Gaffney, the original drummer, Jason Lowenstein, who joined in 89, and Lou Barlow, the other founding member, they all played their part in contributing to the early catalogue with their own particular flavour, and that gave the band a really unusual musical identity, I think. And the identity was sometimes confused, if that that can be an identity. One of the things that did consistently unite them, though, was that lo-fi approach to recording. Sebadoh were really pioneers of that, along with bands like Guided by Voices. Using 4-track recorders. I mean, literally 4 tracks. 1 track for all the drums, 1 track for guitar, 1 track for bass, 1 track for vocals. You could kind of bounce them down. So I remember doing this as well with friends, including Matt. We had a 4-track recorder. We would do guitar and bass, and then when we thought they were about right, we'd record the 2 of them onto something else that would give you 2 more to play with. And you could do that, but then it meant you couldn't go backwards. You couldn't undo that once you'd mixed it. So there were a lot of limitations, but those limitations actually had a lot of benefits as well. And people really embraced the imperfections of that approach to recording.
Trick yourself into slow-mo. Made an angel in the snow.
And it defined the early years of this band. It felt very honest. It felt very punk in its own way, very DIY, because it was. And that is something that when you look back at the really early years, you definitely can't deny that there's an attainability about their music, the sense that anybody could have done it. Yeah,
I was actually surprised because up until recently, I haven't really known a great deal about Sebadoh apart from Harmacy, really, and going back and listening to the early stuff is interesting. It's almost kind of Daniel Johnson-y.
Yeah.
Fame is spreading across the land. Now I've got me a band, my fame is spreading across the land. My life is starting over again.
And quite kind of, cut and paste and kind of, very DIY
and playful.
Like it reminds me a little bit of like anti-folk as well. There's a wee bit of that there, but very rudimentary almost in a way.
Yeah. So to flesh it out a little bit, the band formed in West Massachusetts in 1986, but as I say, their genesis is sort of complicated, and it both kind of predates that, because a number of these songs already existed. In fact, a number of these songs had been released, and then it also postdates that, in that they became a much more serious concern as a band when Lou Barlow lost his place in Dinosaur Jr, who really became one of the iconic 90s alternative acts.
Seen enough to eye you, but I've seen too much to try you. It's always weirdness why you dig it much too much to fry you. The weirdness flows between.
As we mentioned, Eric Gaffney, that original drummer and founding member with Lou, he's described by Lou himself as mercurial. Could be quite a difficult character and kind of a little bit unpredictable, I believe. As I said, Jason Lowenstein joined the band in 1989. Jason Lowenstein is a really talented musician. I think, actually, the members of the band, certainly Lou would concede that Jason was by far the most musically naturally gifted within the group, and could also turn his hand to a lot of different instruments. He's a really good drummer, really good guitarist. He's worked on multiple instruments on his own projects as well. But it was when the three of them came together that the band really got set out in that road to kind of cult indie status that they attained. Over the years, they've also enjoyed the drum services of a number of other folks. Bob Fay, who performed on Bakesale and on Harmacy. Bob D'Amico, who I think is the current drummer, their latter day. A drummer called Russell Pollard, who performed on their eponymous 7th album, the Sebadoh.
The Sebadoh.
Yeah.
You can feel anything you want to feel. You can feel anything you want to feel and call it real. But I don't want to be the one who rides slave. I don't want to be the one who rides slave.
It's worth saying that because of the interview, we will probably come at this from a disproportionately Lou Barlow orientated perspective, and that's by virtue not just of him having sat down with us, but also because for me personally, and this is obviously my choice, Lou's outlook and his songwriting came to represent many of my favourite aspects of Sebadoh as a project. His songwriting started to become more distinct around about the time of Harmacy, and it was just the stuff that I felt really drawn to. I really liked a lot of Jason's songs, but would they have occupied that real affectionate place that I reserved for Sebadoh? Probably not. I think Lou was the one that really made sure of that. So there's another key part of this, because as we say, Sebadoh was a thing, and then it became a greater thing when Lou was somewhat unceremoniously booted out of Dinosaur Jr. Now, he was a founding member of that band. He wasn't having as significant a role in terms of songwriting after a while in that band. Jay Mascis, another mercurial talent, really kind of became synonymous with that project, and eventually Lou was ejected, at which point Sebadoh was his main outlet for not just his material, but I think also a lot of the justifiable frustrations that he felt at his experience within that group. So he founded Dinosaur Jr. along with Jay Mascis and Patrick Murphy. Dinosaur Jr. was a much bigger project financially and commercially speaking than Sebadoh, and I do think when you hear the interview, you'll hear how that disparity in success plays a little bit of a part. In Lou, there's a really telling comment he makes about being jealous of himself sometimes in interviews, which is confusing, but when you consider it in that light, I think there's a bit of that. I think Dinosaur Jr., I don't care too much for them, if I'm being honest.
I don't think I could tell you one Dinosaur Jr. song.
I'll cut some stuff in, but there are some of the tracks are truly iconic of that era, and some of the records.
I'll probably recognise them to hear them then, but I've never really sat down and listened to them.
I've been to see them as well, and I think quite typically, given what you hear about Jay and his domination of that band, when I did go and see them, the gig was fairly awful because all you could hear was Jay. Yeah, I think he had something like 8 cabinets on stage for his guitar. It was in the ABC2 before it burned down. And I had gone because Lou had returned to the fold, so I went to see Dinosaur Jr. to see Lou Barlow, and I'll be damned if I could hear anything Lou was doing.
Really?
It was definitely loud, definitely loud with guitar. It was a horrendous gig to watch, honestly, and that was really because it was the J Mascis show, and that wasn't what I was there for. By the way, Dinosaur Jr., this isn't a Dinosaur Jr. episode, but it's interesting that the original name was Dinosaur, but they had
there was another band called Dinosaur.
Add the Jr., for legal reasons. For some time, they'd been seen as being hot in the heels of Nirvana. That never happened, although they did do really well. Lou will discuss that a wee bit. Personally, I never really understood how people came to expect anything like that level of success of them. I didn't think they had the tunes or the general dynamic. Jay has a very distinct persona, but it's not one that I see as translating into somebody you'd want to spend a great deal of time listening to speak. He doesn't seem interested in speaking much, frankly. They were a solid alternative project, but for me they were much more suited to the sort of level of bands like the Posies or Buffalo Tom. Reasonable indie success, but absolutely not anything that I would ever have bracketed in with a band like Nirvana. What do I know? But yeah, the personalities and the trajectory of that band, as I say, played a very important part in both Lou's personal story and the emergence of Sebadoh, or the promotion of Sebadoh to his central focus. And I suppose in a way thus it had a big impact on the lives of the OG members of Sebadoh as well, Eric and Jason. To give a wee bit of insight, and this is something that really will come across in the interview when you hear it, but to give a bit of a backstory to that, Jay and Lou have a dysfunctional relationship, to say the least. I've seen Lou live, and he makes jokes on stage about, he's got certain songs that are about Jay and about the way he was kicked out the band and about his very mixed feelings towards their relationship, but he then laughs. He says, it doesn't matter though, because Jay won't ever hear them because he doesn't listen to my music, which is crazy because these guys have been working together for nearly 30 years. And he's confident that he won't ever hear what he said about him, which is mad. Although admittedly, last time I saw him, he did also say that about his ex-wife. She wouldn't hear what he'd said about her either. Lou says that he and Jay to this day don't chat. That's a quote. Even since reconciling, I mean, bearing in mind that they're touring the world currently. They reconciled, but the conversation just isn't there. I believe Murph has sort of embraced his role as a bit of a mediator in the relationship. Oh, do this, do that. Can we arrange this? Do you think Lou will do this? Do you think Jay will do that? That seems like there's no real dynamic.
He's like Craig and Bros.
Craig, is that how it was?
Aye, Lou and Jay are like Matt and Luke Goss with their dysfunctional relationship, and then
there's a lot of other parallels between the two bands, isn't there? But it's a really interesting insight into the dynamic between these two guys. It seems very quietly odd, a bit like Jay himself, I suppose. But
yeah.
As a pair, they'd first met in a project called Deep Wind. It was a hardcore project in West Massachusetts. Lou had set it up with a guy called Scott Helland. Lou was very much a hardcore kid, punk and hardcore kid, and they were joined by Jay on drums. Jay, a bit like Jason Lowenstein, is a really talented multi-instrumentalist. Yeah, really. I mean, he's a great guitarist if you like his stuff or not. He is a very talented guitarist. He then obviously wanted to write songs, given he was just overflowing with creativity. And Lou Barlow admits himself that he was shocked to be invited to the project that resulted from that, Dinosaur Jr. It's really interesting to read interviews and just articles by fans of Dinosaur Jr. at the time who clearly feel bad for Lou Barlow. From early on, it's very apparent that he was somewhat dazzled by J Mascis as both a musician and because he was a bit of an enigma. The stories of J Mascis' treatment of Lou from the early days make kind of tough reading. His admiration of him kind of leads to everything from Lou Barlow was given these backing lyrics where he had to repeatedly sing Why Don't You Like Me? Why Don't You Like Me as part of one of Jay's songs. Right the way through, apparently Jay used to consistently make gay jokes about Lou Barlow.
Like hazing, a kind of form of hazing kind of in it.
It's really odd. In the, what's his name, Michael Azerrad book, This Band Could Be Your Life, there's quite a large, I think it's maybe even an entire chapter about Dinosaur Jr. and that goes into this in quite a lot of depth. If you do have that, or if you know someone that's got it, it's worth dipping into it. It's really fascinating. Azerrad is not inclined to go to tread softly in that chapter. Years later, a film actually came out about Dinosaur Jr. and it's made by like a direct relative of J Mascis, and as a result, it sort of kind of shines it up a wee bit. You know, I mean, there's a lot of things like the whole thing about the gay jokes and that is omitted from the movie, but it's just a weird kind of cruelty. There's something really grim about it, and Lou's ultimate dismissal from Dinosaur Jr. is pretty harsh as well. The other two had actually told him that the band was splitting up whilst they were simultaneously booking a tour and advertising for a replacement member, so they didn't even just say to him. So I think he left that band feeling, I think, understandably pretty maligned and embittered.
I think it probably will have left its mark on him for sure.
And it's just so fascinating that, I mean, they're older, sort of, I would say, wizened guys now, so I think they're somewhat jaded. I mean, it seems, to be honest, that J Mascis was always a little bit jaded, but that ability to exist in a band and in constant proximity to somebody who you have such a confused relationship with, it's quite hard to empathise with, I think. I don't know if I would have the patience for that. Lou, at the same time as acknowledging all this, he seems able to be quite complimentary about Jay. You know, he says very, very funny. He really likes that about him. He loves his creative energy. But bearing in mind as well that Lou was also in a band with Eric Gaffney, who was, you know, maybe not in the same way as Jay, but a difficult personality. And Lou also talks about how that led to some really, really interesting creative results. And he enjoyed that friendship, even though it could be really difficult, and even though it meant that the band often wasn't actually a lot of fun. You don't want to psychoanalyse people too much, but there's maybe an element of he's just become maybe a wee bit too used to these difficult, unappreciative kind of musical pairings that you maybe can expect a bit better than that. You would hope that you could, because he seems a really affable guy. You know, he's very subdued, but very generous when I got a chance to sit with him. He was very accommodating, you know, and he didn't have to be. We'll go to the interview shortly. I want to preempt that a wee bit by saying it was recorded on the hoof at short notice, so I apologise. It's a little bit noisy, but we had to do it backstage before the show. You'll hear people coming in and out of the room, including J Mascis, and even his footsteps sound grumpy.
He looks grumpy, I think, in his photographs.
Yeah. I was in a lift with a guy as I was leaving, and I mean, he could not have cared less. But the good thing is, neither could I, because I'm totally indifferent to the fella. But I was very excited to meet Lou, and I was really rewarded by both how gregarious he was, but also by how generous he was with his time. He hadn't had his dinner. I think he'd landed at 3 a.m. that day. He'd gone to the venue, they'd sound checked, and his dinner was basically going on the table downstairs, but he just kept talking until eventually I had to be like, go and have something to eat, please. I feel like I'm taking up too much of your time. So we'll go over that interview now. Hopefully, for the folks that aren't too familiar with Sebadoh, this will help the interview make a little bit more sense, and then we'll
reconvene.
Right, Lou, thanks for your time. Welcome to Unsung Podcast. Really appreciate you making space for this in what's got to be a pretty hectic day. I've run you through the basics of what the podcast is about, so I'm just going to dig into a few questions here, and please feel free to improvise as much as you like.
Sure.
Right off the bat, if I put you on the spot, is there a Sebadoh record that you'd call your favourite?
Sebadoh 3.
Sebadoh 3?
Yeah.
Any particular reasons that that's so quick to your mind?
It's mostly recorded at home, although it was mixed in a studio, and then we do have studio. It's a good mix. It's a mix of like studio and home recordings that were really well transferred in the studio, and we had like, it was a real studio. It was Fort Apache, which was a big home for all of the Boston bands at the time, like the Lemonheads and Johnny Hatfield and all that. And
iconic in that scene.
Yeah, the guys that produced it, Sean Slade and Paul Colgary, were they did like the first Radiohead record among many things, and Bug by Dinosaur Jr. So they were familiar to me, and we were able to afford 3 days of studio time, and we just packed it full of. It was just a really great mix of like Eric Gaffney's incredibly unique songs and some home recordings that I had really worked, and I like the record. I think it's kind of psychedelic. I think it's very present. It's like it has got a really lovely balance because of that method that you're talking about between the DIY kind of sensibility and then a bit of slightly higher production, like a slight clarity and volume. Yeah, I mean, we used 8 tracks for the electric tracks, and then but it was it was all. Yeah, I just think it's a really eclectic, kind of challenging, disturbing, scary, sweet record. I don't know.
That's kind of the band in a nutshell, man. It's so many different adjectives. Are there any other records that the reaction to them surprised you, whether for the positive or the negative?
I don't know if anything really surprised me. I mean, Sebadoh 3 was good. We had a great response to that, and then after that, Smash Your Head and Bakesale were really embraced, but we were kind of on a little bit of a trajectory then, so it wasn't too surprising, and it wasn't too over the top, you know what I mean? We were nothing was ever crazy, It's like we weren't like all of a sudden selling out every show, and I mean, Dinosaur Jr., that was pretty surprising, like when we put out our second record, and then it was just like, whoa, then we're in NME and we're going to England, and that was surprising.
Yeah, that's a band that exploded, right?
Yeah, it kind of exploded, and we were pretty. I mean, Sebadoh was much more of a modest, but I don't know. For me, I guess it was just cool to be able to have another band and go back to the places I had been with Dinosaur Jr. in a new way and in a new attitude, But
and what about in the long term? Because some of them, I mean, Sebadoh 3 is a good example, and probably Bakesale as well. They've had a real staying power. They've become kind of revered as these icons of the indie scene at that time. Mm-hmm. Did you see that happening at the time? Did you feel this was the one that was going to stick?
I don't know. I mean, I guess I always compared us to other bands and never thought we really fit in with anything. I mean, I thought we weren't, not to say we weren't as good, but I just, like when Pavement happened, I was like, oh man, they were just so much of they were a challenging band, but they were also lighter. And they at least initially, when they were the initial lineup of Pavement, were kind of joyous actually, because they had this crazy drummer and they smiled on stage. And then, I mean, I'm not saying this because I'm here in Glasgow, but a band like Teenage Fan Club as well, sort of just had this really light presence, and I just realized that Sebadoh were quite dark, that we were really conflicted, like at our core, we were very conflicted. We were very, our shows were, to say they were hit and miss would be generous to say. I mean, we went between being awful and then having some really great moments, but we were incredibly inconsistent, and I think the records were kind of inconsistent as well. So
The sound is so eclectic, though. It must be hard to make every aspect of that sound work every night. There'll be nights when the high energy stuff really clicks, and there'll be nights when...
Yeah, and we also, I mean, it had a lot to do with the lineup, too. Like with Eric Gaffney, he was just incredibly mercurial and would just refuse to play his songs from night to night, or if he wasn't happy, he wouldn't really play my songs, or he would purposely, I mean, it was just, he was very, and honestly, I loved that about him, and that's why I formed a band with him, because he was confrontational. And my idea, we kind of came more from kind of a very punk, and when I say punk, I mean just kind of like we had a bad attitude, just like from the beginning, and that was what we liked, and that's what I thought bands did, and what we were meant to do was to challenge audiences and to be difficult. And then as, indie rock started to take off in the early 90s, and with bands like I said, Superchunk, Teenage Fan Club, Pavement, it was like all of a sudden, our sort of punk pedigree started to feel really like, I could see it being off-putting to people, and I could see that that our lack of consistency was going to work against us.
It's a definite a recurring theme in the titles and just in the general chat around the band in those early years, and even your early stuff solo. It's just punk, the attitude of being punk.
I mean, to this day, even Dinosaur Jr., we did a festival in Australia years ago. I mean, it was during the very first Pavement reunion, and Pavement were on stage, and they were great. They actually, and I was like, wow, they seemed a lot, because they've come sort of, their arc to me, like towards the end of the not the original lineup, but the second lineup with Steve West on drums. I mean, they got a little bit like, their performances weren't quite as sparkling, let's say, and they had kind of settled into. So, but then to see them reunite, they seemed really happy, and I was psyched to see that. And Jay just said, like, bands shouldn't smile on stage, and I was like, that's it. Like, that is really where we still embody that to a degree. Like, we don't communicate that well with the audience. It's not really a thing. It's like there's not really much of a. It's kind of like us and like us against the world a bit still to this day.
Yeah, you could probably put you guys on a spectrum, with Pavement having the highest ratio of maybe slight comedy to their videos and stuff.
Yeah.
And then you've got Brendan in Teenage Fan Club. He was quite off the wall. Then maybe Superchunk, and then yourselves. That can kind of.
Yeah, we still. But I mean, the fact is, we started in the very early '80s. I mean, our contemporaries were not. I mean, like,
they were poffies.
We were precursors. We were actually precursors to the Pixies. They weren't really like peers per se. They were like, they kind of came after us. All of that stuff, we were kind of like, and I'm not saying this like, we were there first. I'm just saying we were literally there.
Yeah.
We were right on the heels of Sonic Youth. We came directly from like hardcore punk rock, and it was a different vibe. Like the early '80s, it was much more confrontational. The bands that we liked, that we were drawn to, like the Birthday Party, were like, bands. This is different. Bands were singing about murder and like being much more just a stage presence was not required. And even when like Jesus and Mary Chain came out, I mean, they were very confrontational. They were like turned their back to the. I mean, it's like that's where we came from. Like we were more like the bands that we were more inspired by and more contemporary and more peers of were like Jesus and Mary Chain, and that's like.
Did you ever think about dabbling in the world of upbeat personas?
The underlining thing for me was actually hardcore punk rock. For as aggressive as it was actually about community as well. So I kind of imagined that I was entering a community, and actually the punk rock thing and hardcore was actually very inclusive, and I did have that. That was a part. I have to say, for me, it was a part of where I came from. It was strange to be in a band. And then realize that, like, I'm in a band, but they hate me. My band hates me. I was like, it was kind of disappointing. It was a bit disappointing initially to just go like, oh, I'm in a band and I don't. I mean, like when Dinosaur started, I mean, I honestly was shocked that I was in the band because I thought I wasn't Jay's first choice for a bass player because we had one in our hardcore band. But when he asked me to join the band, I was like, honestly, and I'm really not trying to like play on old themes or anything because everyone knows the story. But I mean, I was honest to God surprised that I was ever. And I did start playing, acoustic music after being kicked out of Dinosaur. I did want to do things that were more inclusive. But then I started a band where I lived in Western Massachusetts, and it's just the vibe. People are 1 foot in it. I mean, back then, every bandmate that I've had in Sebadoh, 1 foot in, 1 foot out, never quite comfortable with the idea of being accepted, never, and I never, because the band was so rooted in just being a democracy and being like, we had to take in everybody's personalities, everybody's thing, and so it made, so the mean, where the mean setup, where the average setup was definitely still confrontational.
So that obviously resulted in Eric leaving, and with Bob on board, Bob Fay, you went and you did Harmacy a couple of records later. I've seen a couple of things written, interviews you've done about how that record you felt it maybe didn't pop, and I know that during the recording process you said the producer was constantly going on about how with Bob on drums it wasn't going to pop. I mean, is it a record you would have liked a second run at, or can you pinpoint anything you would have done differently?
I think if I was to do anything differently, it would have been to record it on 4-track. Because, I mean, if you look back at that time especially, it's like if you have records now that are regarded, it's like the Guided by Voices records from that period are recorded on they had the same 4-track that I had. I'm like, had we taken those songs and recorded them on 4-track as opposed to trying to, because we were responding to the pressure that the record company was like, well, you really got to do this and here's your big budget and go to the studio. But I knew the studio would expose the limitations of the band. And it did. I mean, without a doubt, it exposed, because I'm a music fan, I'm a listener, I understand. When singles from the record weren't hitting, I was like, well, that's because, the band as it existed with Bob Fay was like, our primary goal was to have fun and to get high and to not fucking, no control freaks, no this, no, it's like our goal was to just, especially after Eric had left, who was such a sort of caustic presence, it was about having a good time. Yeah. And I knew it's like and having a good time, is not what you do if you're going into a studio and someone's throwing $60,000 at you.
Yeah.
It's like you have to get in there and do that. And because we didn't, and it absolutely exposed the weaknesses of the band. Whereas had we done it on 4-track, 4-track cassette is a wonderful way to just, like a band like Guided by Voices, who were not a particularly dynamic band, when they were recording those things, and those songs are not particularly dynamic, but they're catchy, and that kind of atmosphere that a 4-track captures would have done the songs on Harmacy. It would have, I think, and it would have done better, ironically, because at that point, ultimately it would have, because at that point people were, it was ironic because we were a lo-fi band, but we abandoned lo-fi just as people were getting used to it, just as people had adjusted to it, just as people were like, hey, we tried to make this step. We tried to just dress ourselves up, and there's a term that it's a very raw term, but it rings true. It's called turd polishing. It's like you're basically taking something. It's like we took turd polishing to this whole next level because of the pressure of that's what we were told the next level was, and that's what we were kind of like. And I like to please people too, so I'm like trying to please these nice people at Sub Pop Records and the nice people at Domino, and where we actually probably could have just taken it back to the fucking practice space and hooked up the 4-track and taken that 4-track cassettes and mixed them in the studio, and it would have actually lasted. The record would have, I think, had more longevity because the songs are for the most part really good.
I wonder if Elliott Smith had similar feelings, because he's somebody I think who really influenced the early stuff, the 4-track stuff, and when he moved over to that kind of high production or mid-fi, as I've seen you refer to it.
Well, Elliott really embraced recording. Like, he was a total gearhead. I've spent, a couple of nights just watching him just buying, just going deep diving on like capacitors and wires. The guy was like, wow. He was obsessed with building a better studio and obsessed with recording.
Oh, right. So it's completely different then.
Yeah, also his playing was that advanced, and his conception of music was more like Beatles. He was just like, I'm going. So he actually had that. I don't think
he was heading for Abbey Road, and you guys were trying to. Yeah,
we would have done. It would have served us better to let's go back. Take it back to the.
It's really interesting to me because Harmacy I'd heard Sebadoh, and it had never clicked for me. Harmacy was the record that got me into the band big time. I don't know if it still sounds really rough to me. I know to you guys it maybe sounds polished in comparison, but the eclecticism alone, that the erratic nature of it, the different nature, the styles of the recording.
Oh, that's cool.
I think there's a lot more roughness to it than it's maybe given credit for just because of context. But for me, it had just that right amount of accessibility and sheen. Stuff like Princess and Beauty of the Ride. Yeah. Absolutely gorgeous songs that I think really do benefit from that sparkle, and it's I can sympathise because it's the aesthetic of the 4-track thing was really good for you guys, the saturation, the colour, the personality of it. Obviously the fan base loved it, but yet there was something kind of punk in risking going to that production level, and even if you're bound to be hypercritical of yourself because you are the musician, but as an audience member, for me that was.
Yeah, I try to filter my impressions of Harmacy, because there are people that legitimately like the record, and my impulse is just I do have an impulse. I mean, there's a lot of things that also occurred around that record that were. It was hard because we had booked studio time, and Jason Lowenstein was meant to come out a week before, and we were meant to rehearse, which was very important with Bob Fay, because he wasn't really a drummer. Like, Bob Fay is not playing drums anymore, for instance. Like, that's not his thing. It was not his thing.
It's a good litmus test.
He was a personality that fit with us. He was our weed connection. He was very, very funny. But when the songs on Bakesale were short, because I was like, I knew what kind of stamina he had as a drummer. Like, a lot of his, and the very interesting thing was that Jason Lowenstein, on the other hand, is a brilliant drummer, and he's a brilliant multi-instrumentalist on the level of Jay Mascis, actually guitar and drums. But we'd had this whole week to rehearse, and Jason totally blew it off and showed up the day that we were meant to go to the studio. So we had to learn the songs and play them in the studio. And then also, Jason, who had his songs on Bakesale had been so brilliant, like, he had actually, I think, very purposely cut his songs into something that Bob could play, which really limited, like, because Jason's capable of, he's, to this day, I'm like, he could have easily stepped into, like, a role in the band that reflected more of how truly talented he was, and how he really actually he potentially had everything that someone like Jay has. But I think he was, for whatever reason, or whatever, maybe it was the weed we were smoking or whatever, but Jason was sort of happier then to step back and go, like, I'm just going to do these I'm going to toss off these kind of punk things, because I know the band can't get through. Bob can't get through that. He can only do this much, and I'm not going to push that, and I'm also going to go into the punk role, because Lou's the pop guy, and now that Eric's gone, somebody's got to fill that role. And he's told me that as much as, like, he felt like he had to become the punk guy, and I'm like, it
did delineate more on that album.
But it doesn't really reflect what Jason is capable of, and and he was capable of much more than. It doesn't mean that he had his songs on Bakesale are equal to mine as far as, like, just how the record is still even. Not Too Amused, Got It. Those songs stand right next to my songs, if not better. And better, actually. But when it came to Harmacy, there was no rehearsing. He showed up the day we started recording, and it was just like.
And as a result, there was more pressure on Bob, because he was.
Yeah, Bob was just like in hell. Because Bob was like, now he's got the red light, and we have this producer guy who's really fucking on Bob's ass, telling me when Bob's not in the studio, we gotta fire him right now. I'll fly something. He's like, I'm gonna fly Joey Warnaker, who's like this big studio drummer. I'll fly him from LA tomorrow, and these songs will. Too Pure in particular, that's what he grilled me on Too Pure. We were recording, and he just looked at me and goes like, this song, if you get a real drummer to play this song, this will, I remember the quote clearly. He said, this song, some kid should be playing this in their parents' car, and when that fucking solo happens, he should drive off a cliff. He's like, this song should make people cry. He's like, and it's not going to happen unless we get rid of Bob right now. And I was like, ugh. And again, as a listener, I'm like, I understood exactly what he was saying. I totally understood that. Yeah. And I was like, he was absolutely right. But because at the same time, it's like that. This is when Jay was going. His recordings were taking a whole other scope. Buffalo Tom, Lemonheads, Teenage Fangs. Like, these bands were like, they were all taking that step up. And I was like, but then, the guy made me cry in the studio. I was like, just like drinking beer and crying. I called Jason. I'm like, we gotta fire Bob. And then he's like, I know. I'm like, oh. But then the next day I woke up kind of hungover. I'm like, I'm not fucking firing Bob. Bullshit. I'm not doing that. It's too hard. I don't want to do that. Yeah. I don't want to introduce that kind of personal drama. I don't want to be the guy that fires my fucking drummer because we're trying to make a record. I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to be that guy. I didn't want to be I didn't want to do the big sellout. I just was not personally ready for it. I didn't want to do it. It was too hard, but it it colored my experience of making that record and then listening to it, and it's unfortunate. And then we ended up firing Bob anyway because we were just like, I couldn't take it. I mean, it's like I couldn't take it anymore because Jason was a much better drummer, and Jason would just sit and just watch Bob like flail away, and I'm like, oh God. I was like, Jesus, if Jason was playing. And I tried to put Jason behind the kit for some of my songs, but Bob couldn't really play bass either. I'm like, but then we ended up firing him for.
What does Bob do now?
He works at Trader Joe's. He works at a supermarket.
Right. Okay.
And I see him regularly, and he's.
Poor Bob, but he found his niche.
He did. I mean, he's like, and he plays in like experimental bands. He plays like guitar and writes songs. He's got a couple of kids and a wonderful wife and a house. And
bless him.
He's a good guy. He's a good guy. I still really like him. Every time I see him at the store or whatever, I'm just like, he's my brother. You know, I love him, and I think he's so funny. But like,
see the sentimentality you're talking about. Sebadoh sounds like a sentimental band. I mean, you sound sentimental in some of the way you deliver some of the more romantic songs, the roughness, the imperfections. That sentimentality seems like it's a function of some of these decisions. You know, if you had got rid of Bob earlier and flown in a session drummer from LA, the band would have a very different feel to it. You would have taken on that sellout thing. It might have been a project that you couldn't have returned to. It might have been something that was changed for good in your mind. That sentimentality, I think there's something to be said for it. I'm sure it was difficult.
No, but it's just theoretical. It's just, it doesn't, I mean, it all comes down to the records. Just like people don't, I mean, you care because you were there. You know what I mean? You were like our audience. You know, there was.
Too Pure did make me cry.
Yeah, I mean, there were people. We had our people. And that were there with us and who were going through that journey with us and who heard it that way and heard it emotionally. But I think, you know, I know enough as a music fan. It's like it all comes down to texture. It comes down to textures on records. It comes down to the playing and the textures that really give things longevity. And
I want to probe you on one more thing before we go on. So you kind of hinted at it where Eric would be in a mood and he wouldn't want to play his own songs or he wouldn't want to play somebody else's songs. Given the way that Sebadoh was the division of labour in the songwriting, can you, off the top of your head, remember any either favourites or most hated songs by the other guys? And did you have any of those kind of arguments where maybe Jason hated one of your tunes?
No, we never fought openly like that. I think I was a little disappointed. I think mostly what happened with the band live was that Jason, he just became more like he felt he had to be the punk guy when we were playing live shows, and he just started playing his songs faster and faster and faster, and he wouldn't play Not to Amuse no matter how many people yelled it at him. He wouldn't. It's like when he got the guitar and I got the bass, you know, he just immediately just would sprint through his entire set of songs and just seemed to be operating on this whole, like, it doesn't matter anyway, nobody cares. And I'm just like, dude. And I remember we had this horrible fight, like one morning, it just kind of came up. I'm like, Jason, can you play your song slower? I can't. He's like, I don't want to play it slower. Why should I play it slower? Nobody cares. And I'm like, people care. I care. And I said, I can't play it. And then he was refusing to sound check his songs too. And I'm like, Jason, can we sound check your songs? No, I'm not going to waste anybody's time sound checking my songs. And you know, real professionals don't sound check. And I'm like, Jason, for me, please. So like, it just became this kind of farce of like, I'm like, look, Jason's, he's a good bit younger than me. He's like 5 or 6 years younger. I was a punk. I was in hardcore. I did that. I played the hall shows, like he didn't, he was like, it's like, you're not a punk. You're a fucking gifted songwriter. You're a multi-instrumentalist. And we had this like crazy fight, and it was like, but then, so he would sound check after that, but every time, like, like, here you go, Lou, here's your, throwing this bone in. I'm like, I can't, there's a lot of guys from my area who just had that. They just had that attitude. Jay's got it. Jay's changed over the year, like since our reunion. Jay has changed. He will sound check. he'll work on things. He warms up his voice. But when I first re-entered the band, Jay was like, I'm not doing anything like that. And so he would like blow his voice out after 2 shows on a tour. I was like, he barely want to sound check. He was like, but now he really, now he's like, Jay is like, I'm like, thank God. It's like, but my old brothers from back in that same, they're still that way. They like, it's still like, they just don't want anybody to think they're trying too hard.
Do you think all the punks ended up being as sensible and mature as you in the band?
No, well, people like fucking, the real fucking godfathers of it, the real like Ian MacKaye, Henry Rollins, those guys have insane work ethics. Mike Watt, those guys don't have any problem saying I care. Like they'd have no problem. And like the people that really were the ones that we looked up to, that's what I was talking about initially, is that hardcore was a sense of community and was a sense of like belonging and community.
And responsibility as well. Responsibility to your audience.
Yeah, like they would like, those guys would like literally, like Ian MacKaye, Henry, Mike, Watt, whatever, they would go out and engage their audiences. Everything that they're like that to this day. It's like they still know that not only do they play the music that they give, but they also know that they're going to like walk out into the crowd and have a fucking 20-minute conversation with a 17-year-old kid who wants to know. I'm like, they're going to do that. It's because that was actually that to me was the real source of it. But with my crew that I came up with, it was like 1 foot in, 1 foot out. This attitude is pervasive on every level culturally where we come from. It's like if you go to the store, that the woman who's behind the cashier, the man, woman, whatever, they want to make sure that they don't want to be there. And it is like a huge part of it. It's a big fucking part of it. And I moved to
Mr. Bob.
Bob actually, but Bob too, it's like, I don't want to try, it's like he still too was like, don't want to practice too much, don't want to, it was just so crazy because when I moved to Los Angeles and I met the Melvins and I'm like, those guys fucking worked. Like everybody I met, every hardcore punk rocker, everybody who was like trying to sell out, they all had the same fucking work ethic. It was like they all cared and worked, and like so you like.
As a kid in that audience, I think we owe you a thanks as well then, because you were kind of fighting our corner. Because if the guys weren't warming up and they were cancelling shows because their voice was blowing out and they were playing their good songs too fast, then we as the audience had no say in that. You were at least up there fighting our fight.
I tried with Jason. I was like, look, it's not just me trying to lean on you like a big, I'm not, because I have a few years on him, so we always had this kind of like, I was always forcing him, whether I was meant to or not, I was always forcing him into something. I was forcing him into this. So like when we had to do the Harmacy record, I was like, he took me wanting to rehearse for a week before we go to the studio as forcing him in to do something. So he just has this knee-jerk resistance to it that like I'm not in control of. And I can't, and there's nothing you can do if somebody feels that way. You're like, I'm not, you can't fight against it. You can't say like, because then you are being the big brother. And you're like come on, man. But I lost all those battles.
Well,
Harmacy to me is like the lost battle. That's like,
it's clear that I've triggered you a wee bit. For me, man, it's an absolute masterpiece. I love that record.
I like the songs, and I'll play them. Like I'm going to play tomorrow night at Sleazy's, and when I play those songs, it's like I did a thing recently. Like I did this artist enabler series where I did a release every month, and 1 month I did all Jason Lowenstein songs. So I made like a 7-inch EP of like Jason Lowenstein songs, and then I did a couple of extra ones. So I did like 7. I sat down and took apart and reassembled 7 of his best songs. And like to this day, I'm just still just like, God damn, like God, if he just, it's like, and Harmacy was it. Harmacy was the time where you just saw it. I just saw it. Although the Sebadoh we did was good because he did help us choose a different drummer, but by that point no one gave a shit. And
really good album as well.
It was a pretty good record.
Tunes by you, man.
Yeah, and Jason killed it on that record too. But at that point we were like, it was done. Our time was over. It was like we had our Harmacy was really the moment that we could have seized it, and we didn't. The Sebadoh was like it was too late. And that was like, by the time we did Sebadoh, we were like doing shows with Modest Mouse and stuff, and I'm like, it's done. Like, we are done.
That's the same,
it was like Modest Mouse. I saw Modest Mouse, I'm like, well, there you go. It's done. It's like that. That now is indie rock. We are old, and our time is over.
And then Johnny Marr joined them.
Yeah, then Johnny Marr joined him, and then the fucking 2000s hit, and it was just a massive wave of like incredibly inspired, hardworking bands, because they all fucking worked hard. They recorded their own shit. Death Cab for Cutie, Modest Mouse, then like later.
Death Cab covered you, didn't they?
They did. That fucking blew my mind.
You got a favourite cover of that? Because there's quite a few of them.
I don't know.
There was like an electronic band called Deadsy did it, I think, as well.
Oh yeah, that one was really funny. That one was super funny. It was almost like a new metal band. That was funny. I think the thing that really blew me away, I went to see Death Cab for Cutie because I liked them. As an audience member, I was just, watching, and then as I was watching them, I was just going like, God damn, I fucking blew it. I'm like, I swear to God, I was like, I was not in a good spot, and I was like, I was just like, Jesus, man, it's just too. It was like early 2000s, and I'm like, I really fucked up, and it's too bad, and whatever. And I'm like, God, nobody cares. This band probably doesn't even know my shit. And I'm like, my God, it's just, I just really blew it. And then they fucking covered Brand New Love, and I was like, what? That was like one of the most mind-blowing. I was like,
Providence.
I was like, holy shit. I mean, it was like as if. I mean, it was just a thing. It was like they delivered this thing, like they just delivered this little message. It was like, it was amazing.
Honestly,
I was like, thank you.
That is absolutely gorgeous.
I was like, I was so shocked, and so I was like, maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, that totally would have knocked you back onto the path,
It did. It was like, it actually did. I was just like, shut up, dude. Stop this. This inner voice needs to fuck itself, and you need to.
So, but we owe them a debt of thanks for that, at least. Thank you very much for your time, Lou.
Oh, yeah.
That was tremendous.
Okay, so that was the interview with Lou Barlow. Thank you very much for that, Lou, if you are listening. It was hard to tell what way that was going to go, but he was just so eager to speak.
Yeah.
I had an idea that I was going to ask him X and Y, but it just kept getting dragged in these much more interesting tangents, so it was a very easy interview to do and also very enjoyable.
Totally.
But I'm sure you agree there's a few things in there that bear probing. I'm really keen to hear your take on it. And it'll be interesting to hear Mark's take on it, because I don't think Mark was familiar with Sebadoh whatsoever. Bearing in mind the fact that Lou is clearly a punk kid and comes from that punk background, bearing in mind that Jason also has a lot of time for that, yet they have that kind of Americana sensibility in some of their bits of music, as well as like some really melodic sort of, not quite Weezerish, but
aye, there is Weezery bits.
There's an American high school college rock thing. Yeah, I kind of feel like there's a lot in here that Mark might get his teeth into, and it'll be really interesting to get his take on it as well when the time comes. From your own perspective, without going too much into the details of the interview, how have you found the last week or so try to get to grips with this extended universe of Sebadoh?
It's been interesting because I really think that my impression of them has been totally coloured by the fact that I got into Harmacy first. And that's been kind of my impression ever since. And I have heard wee bits of like Bakesale or Bubble and Scrape here and there, but I certainly didn't hear any of the early stuff before. And I think a lot about the Lou Barlow stuff. Like you said, it tends to be his stuff that you identify more with, or that speaks to you more, has more of a resonance. And I think I find him just quite interesting, the relationship dynamics, the mental health aspects of him as well, because I know, I went online, started reading some articles, and he's been quite open about his experiences with social anxiety and depression and stuff like that, and the toxic relationships, and the, not even just within the band, but relationships in general are a big theme for him and his music, and it's been interesting to hear more of that. So yeah, I think I've enjoyed thinking about them as a band, what was going on, knowing a lot about the dynamics now that I didn't know before between band members, but also Lou Barlow's personal relationships and things like that, and where they fitted in with just that scene at the time and all the other bands round about it. It has kind of filled in maybe like the map in my mind. It's like it's loaded up a few more different pages in terms of like my knowledge of that time.
It's interesting to see them go from being just a bunch of musicians on a record to being these kind of fleshed out 3-dimensional, 4-dimensional characters, you know, and seeing the changes in their personality and all these various motivations and, you know, turning points in their life. That's been really interesting, and it's cast some of the music in a really different light for me. I'm also really curious to hear, once we start digging into the records next week, some of your takes on the various eras, because there are points in their career that I thoroughly enjoy. There are points that I'll be honest, I don't really get a lot out of. So you're so new to this. It's going to be fascinating to hear which of those translate.
What I will say was quite difficult was I was doing this on Spotify, and Spotify's got all the reissues. So I mean,
400 songs an album.
Harmacy hasn't been reissued, I think deliberately. They didn't want that to be reissued. We can talk about that next week, I suppose. But the other ones, the Freedman and Weed Forest, and I mean, one of them's got like 50 odd tracks on it, and even though some of the tracks are really small, it's quite an effort to get through that.
Yeah, and sonically, those ones are from that lo-fi era, which I actually find quite fatiguing. Yeah,
because it's like Daniel Johnson levels of inanity. If that offends you.
Cats snoring. Yeah. So we'll do that. We'll dig into the back catalogue with the benefit of Mark's third opinion, and we'll have a wee look at a couple of the offshoots that came from Sebadoh's various members. Yeah. And we'll obviously look at Harmacy in a bit more detail, and then we've got a Nexus. And the Nexus next week, just as a wee reminder, because it's such a fucking awesome choice, is the legendary Catman of Greenock. You felt conflicted about this, didn't you?
Yeah. I do.
It's a wee soul, isn't it?
Right. We'll talk about that next week, but yeah.
Yeah. As soon as any listener looks that up and sees that first picture, they're going like, what the absolute fuck is that? That is a man lying under a bus with a rat in his mouth. Yeah. If that didn't intrigue you, nothing will. Okay, so join us next week for part 2 of Harmacy by Sebadoh.
Okay, see you next week.